make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
And so you've got the depictions of Nicholas. Thomas Nast is a famous political cartoonist in the 1800s. 1865, he draws Nicholas, and he's got him in like some kind of Arctic location, but he's got the red coat and the white fur trim, and he's hanging out kind of with the Eskimos or whatever. But it just starts to snowball, right? So you just start getting these images of Nicholas.
Hi there, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, it's great to have you here. We're thankful for your attention and your support. Also, if you're joining us on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with people that you think will benefit from this. We really try to bring out quality content for you guys, thought-provoking discussion, and we're excited to be here today. And of course, I have Will Wright. I'm Josh Burtram, faithful host, and I have Will Wright, our political host. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It's good to be seen.
Yes, and today we have the distinct honor and privilege to have Dr. Adam C. English on the show with us today. He is a chair of the Department of Christian Studies at Campbell University in Buies Creek, North Carolina. He's an expert in theology and religious history, and he's the author of The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus, The True Life and Trials of Nicholas of Myra. And he explores the life of St. Nicholas and his transformation into Santa Claus, which probably should prompt me to say, if you have kids with you and you're listening to this and they believe in Santa Claus, that's awesome, but you might want to pause and listen at a later point because we are going to be going in depth on all the ideas and myths and everything around Santa Claus. So there's that. Go ahead and do that. And Dr. English's work bridges historical Christian traditions with contemporary cultural and ethical discussions, making him a sought-after scholar and speaker. And it's so great to have you on the show with us today, Adam. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Josh and Will, it is a real honor to be with you guys, and I look forward to a really great conversation.
Yes, same here. So, we got this idea that we wanted to kind of explore the seasonal ideas of Santa Claus and the things around the holidays. And of course, when I go outside and I see Santa Claus, all I think of is a big fat guy with a huge white beard that breaks and enters into all of our homes and steals our cookies and milk. Or you can take that another perspective, I guess, if you want. But before we dig into all that, I would love for you to kind of give us a sense of what got you into wanting to study Santa Claus and Saint Nick. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you want to study Santa Claus, right? And Saint Nicholas. It kind of comes from, I guess, two directions. One is obviously, like a lot of people, I love the Christmas season and the Santa Claus traditions. Maybe like a lot of your listeners, I grew up in a family that had very mixed opinions and mixed views about Christmas and Santa Claus. Our folks kind of came from a charismatic, very, very socially conservative background. And so Santa Claus was always, yeah, exactly. So Santa Claus was always seen with, a high degree of suspicion. My parents would do like a birthday cake for Jesus on, Christmas Eve and things like that. And they wanted us to have some of those Christmas traditions, but, Santa, you move the letters around, it spells Satan, there's always a little bit of suspicion there that.
Yes, you're right.
Exactly. So we're, is this watering down, obviously, the gospel message? Is it making us consumeristic? Is it secular? I mean, they had a lot of those kind of concerns with us kids growing up. So it was never easy. And maybe they were in some ways like Martin Luther. You may remember Martin Luther also had a little bit of a tortured relationship with the holiday and the gift giving. He was credited with having introduced the idea of the Christ child, the Christkindl, as the gift giver instead of Saint Nicholas being the gift giver, because he had children. He adopted, I think, 6 kids ultimately. So he liked the idea of giving gifts, and even on some of his receipts, that we have preserved, they have Nicholas gifts. So he liked that, but he also realized, hey, maybe that's taking the focus off of Jesus. And so instead of Santa Claus or St. Nicholas, let's have Christ, the baby Christ, give the gifts to the children. And so I think my parents were probably somewhere in that line of thinking that we're not really comfortable with Santa Claus being in the house, but we do want to give gifts to our children and celebrate the holiday and sing the carols and, all of that festive activity. So there was that side that had me really thinking about who this person was. And then the other side of it is that I get the opportunity to lead study abroad trips to Italy as part of my job. It's a terrible part of the job, I got to tell you. But it was in the course of that I learned that the bones of St. Nicholas are buried in Bari, Italy, which is on the eastern coast of Italy. And more importantly than the bones, there's an archive library there. And there's some really great research and scholarship being done by a Dominican scholar, a couple of Dominican scholars there. And, that just got me. So having been in Italy, it was sort of like, well, I could go there. And so I got a research grant, was able to spend some time there, search the archives, look at some of these documents, and began to realize that this was not only a historical person, there's a lot of historical data, and there's a lot of legendary data too, so to be clear. But there's a historical person, and that this is a person that was deeply committed to his faith and to serving his community and doing good and justice in the world. And it sort of just transformed my whole view of St. Nicholas, to be sure, and then also the Santa Claus traditions and what they could be for Christian families and just families in general.
So, no more than 5 minutes into the show, you've already said Santa Claus is dead. So since
that is true. I'm glad we put that warning out there. Yeah, there are bones. That's a really fascinating piece of the story. I know we're maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but yeah, so there are bones of St. Nicholas in Bari, Italy. That's not where he was originally buried. Of course, he's originally, as we may discuss, from Turkey, and his bones were buried there, but they were collected in the Middle Ages and translated. That's the term they use. Instead of stolen, they translated them from the original burial place to Bari. And then the Venetians came to Turkey and scooped up the remaining fragments of bones and have buried them in Venice, Italy. So there are actually two locations where the bones are buried, or parts of the bones. And then beyond that, there are bone fragments and relics kind of scattered throughout Europe and even in the United States. I mean, there are things, something like 17 or 18 thumbs of Nicholas that had been preserved. So I don't know how many thumbs he had. And some of these you'd say, well, how would you know? Unless you and they're very small fragments. You'd have to do some kind of DNA testing, I suppose. Who knows, right? But we've got a pretty good sense that the bones buried in Bari and in Venice come from the same person, and that very likely this is the actual bones of St. Nicholas. There's no real reason to not believe that. Anyways,
how do we get from a person that was a saint, and I'm not smart enough to know how somebody becomes a saint, but how do we get from that to like an overweight white guy bringing my kids presents like every year?
Yeah, that is a long story. I don't know how much we want to tell that story right at this moment in the process, but you're right. It's a long story. Saint Nicholas was, to be sure, the most popular non-biblical saint in the Middle Ages and throughout much of Christian history, really right up until the Reformation. The most popular non-biblical. So probably Mary and Jesus, of course, and people like that would be the most popular saints, if you will. But for somebody that wasn't in the Bible, So extremely popular and connected with a lot of, patronages. A lot of groups and countries and cities looked to him. So he was extremely popular. So it's not a surprise that popularity carried somehow into, the modern age. And it's really an American story as to how he became Santa Claus, as he sort of lost some of those religious features and was domesticated for family use, but also commercialized, right? And turned into kind of a commercial representative of the season. And again, we could say a lot more about that. It might be good to sort of back up a little bit and then move forward.
Yeah, I just think this is such a great conversation because there's so much I had no idea about. Like I was telling Will, I was reading through your entry into the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, and I was like, did you know that Santa Claus punched a heretic in the face at the Council of Nicaea, or at least supposedly did? So kind of talk to us about who was the original Saint Nicholas? Who is this person? Where were they born? How did they become someone that was prominent? And and maybe we can start there and then we'll work through some of these transformations over time.
That's probably the better way to go because it's such a long story, right? I mean, in a sense, it's a story that is as rich as, any story from the Bible that is carried to today. Nicholas was born sometime after the year 260. And in southern Turkey, a town called Patara, and then he, lived and worked in a town called Myra. And both of those, by the way, are mentioned in the book of Acts as places that Paul made port. And there's a church there in Patara. You could think this is probably where he grew up. And we know from the records that he grew up in a Christian home and learned all those stories about faith, and then eventually became the pastor or in the minister. I mean, the term they would have used then was bishop. But again, for our listeners today, right, we would have to set aside some of the expectations about a bishop. This is just an overseer of that church community there in Myra. And, so he was what's exciting about his life and people of his generation, when he was born and grew up and kind of made his way into the world, Christianity was technically an illegal religion. And some of the biggest imperial outburst of persecution happened in 303, the Emperor Diocletian. And, he was alive during all that. And burning of churches and burning of scriptures and imprisonment of Christian leaders. But then, as you probably know the story, Emperor Constantine ultimately took the reins and through the Edict of Milan in 313, declared Christianity to be tolerated and then ultimately preferred as the religion of the empire, the religion of the emperor himself. And so there's this massive transformation and shift during Nicholas's lifetime from being part of a minority and persecuted religious group to now being the preferred group of religious identity of the empire. And so that Council of Nicaea that you mentioned is called by the Emperor Constantine to his temporary residence in Nicaea. And he's presiding over it. He's there. And he's calling together Christian leaders. And then what they're trying to do is really work out some of the basics of the Christian faith in some details. And we've got pretty good evidence that Nicholas was in attendance there. His name appears in those lists of attendees. We know there were about 300 bishops in attendance. And, so again, I'm thinking about this is a faith and politics podcast, right? There's a lot you could really reflect on there, right? About somebody who was born into a world where Christianity was illegal and persecuted and ultimately dies in an empire where Christianity is not only accepted, but now being given preferential treatment. And there's money being used to build churches. And we've got even some evidence that in Myra, where Nicholas was, that some of the pagan temples or just old traditional temples of Artemis and such were being torn down sort of by official decree. And so he goes from being the persecuted to, kind of the persecutor in some ways. So, I don't want to overplay that, right, in the sense that he was not personally harassing anybody, but he's certainly part of that major shift in politics in his own lifetime. But what we know about him is that he did good. He was a kind of a patron of his community. We've got stories about him, intervening in kind of legal matters. We've got stories of him intervening on behalf of his community for grain and food supplies. So it's somebody that was more than just a Bible study pastor. This is somebody that was deeply invested in his community. And I think that's really exciting, right? If we think about faith and politics, what are our models for ministers and for churches to certainly be orthodox, committed to their faith, but also deeply invested in the well-being of their communities and in justice. So we've got a model right here. And like as Will said, now he's turned into a big fat white guy that just gives out presents to kids, which is a shame, right?
So much there. And I'm curious, like, did he have kids or anything, or married? I'm not really sure what the rules are for being a saint.
Well, that's a great question. Not that we know of that he had kids. The rule about celibacy, priests being celibate, did not come about till later in the Middle Ages. So it was kind of a mixed bag. Some would have remained single, but some certainly would have married and had kids, but not that we know of.
Got it. So after his brief stint in the heretical MMA world, at what point in time did people look back and say, "Wow, like that guy was a pretty awesome, inspirational character. Like we should build him up somehow," or is that basically where his story stopped? And then, when the settlers came to America, they resurrected his imagery.
Yeah. So immediately after his death, his fame and popularity began to spread. Partly, it seems like partly, or maybe even primarily, because Nicholas was a patron saint of sailors and people involved in sea trade, right there on the coast of Turkey. And there are a couple of really exciting and famous stories about Nicholas, rescuing people at sea. And so you can imagine that as people are traveling, they're primarily traveling by sea from place to place as merchants and, sailors. They're carrying those stories of Nicholas with them from port to port. So he kind of quickly becomes more than just a regional, hero to being somebody who is known and celebrated sort of throughout Europe and the Mediterranean area and making his way into Britain. We even have evidence of, and early from the 11th century, a Viking chapel named after Nicholas. So he's spreading, far and wide, but primarily, I think, because he gets associated with sailors. So if you think about, hey, who's our mascot? At that point, think of maybe a patron saint more like, your mascot for your team. Well, Nicholas is our mascot, and so we're going to carry icons of Nicholas, amulets of Nicholas. We're going to put out Nicholas bread on the water as we set sail. And first people are asking, who is this Nicholas? And then they give them a chance to tell those stories, and then they take those stories to the next town. So, in fact, one of the very first ports in the Americas, named by the sailors that arrived here, was St. Nicholas Port. And so, yeah, I think that maybe explains why he was so popular so quickly early on. And then, everybody else wants to get in the game. So he became a patron saint not only of sailers, but of pawnbrokers and bankers and brewers and families and children, and so on and so forth. So just becomes an extremely popular. And maybe one of the reasons he became so popular, not only is that connection to sailors, but Nicholas's life is not like a lot of other medieval saints in the sense that he did not die as a martyr, some grisly, horrific death. He doesn't have a lot of, crazy miracles, parting the Red Sea and stuff like that. The stories they were telling about him were a lot of times just pretty ordinary kind of things. And I think that's, relatable, right? He's doing things that other people could relate to and do themselves. As I mentioned to you, there's a story of him intervening on behalf of some men that have been wrongly accused. And he just basically steps in and stops an execution of these 3 innocent individuals, but not by using any kind of miraculous, smoke and mirrors, whatever. He just kind of uses his kind of moral authority to do that. And, I think as people retold those stories, they, something they could relate to. I'm not sure that answers your question exactly, but
it's really good. What's interesting to me, so there's so many traditions, right, that have sprung up around Santa Claus. And of course, we're wanting to get into map this transformation, which we've really began to do, right? And then help it come to the place where it's there's this cultural view of Santa Claus today that is rooted in this idea of St. Nicholas. There's some overlap, and yet it's so profoundly different in this transformation. So trying to make sense of it and then trying to understand its application for us. And one of the things that I just think is interesting is this idea. Well, one, just Christmas itself seems like it's this unbelievable mixture of all these different, I think in your article you mentioned Germanic Yuletide, a Greek festival, Saturnalia, this pagan festival in the Roman Empire, the birth of Jesus, and then Saint Nick's birthday on December 6th. So help me make sense of that. And then maybe as icing on the cake, how did we get to this place where he's so associated with chimneys? And I think and maybe we can take that just a step at a time, but chimneys, reindeer, elves, right? I mean, it's wait, what the heck? It's such a weird conglomeration of things and traditions. But I mean, just for this one, just focus on that idea maybe of all these different cultural festivals that came together. Kind of talk to us about that. How do we get this holiday season that we've inherited today?
There's a scholar, Bruce Forbes, who I really like where he starts. He writes about Christmas and Christmas traditions. And Forbes says that you really have to start with winter. And especially in Europe, you're thinking about winter is dark, it's cold, it's dreary. And so what are you going to do? And there's not much to do, right? Because it's dark and cold and dreary. So you're going to throw a party. And, I don't know that you could provide a lot of direct evidence that that's how these things began, but it makes a lot of sense that for the Greeks with Linnea and the Romans with Saturnalia, and then, the British and the Teutonic Germanic people doing Yule celebrations and all these kinds of things. Well, what else would you do at this time of year other than have some kind of, so what would the party look like? Well, it would involve lights because it's a dark time of the year. So you're going to have, it's going to be candles and try to make it brighter. And you're going to try to pull in greenery, mistletoe and evergreen and things like that you could sort of brighten up the space. And you're going to try to, just like any party, you're going to have food and drink and, meat. A lot of the, slaughtering seasons are happening here in midwinter. And then when are you going to put this thing? Well, it's around December 25th when you have kind of the darkest day of the year, but it's about to start becoming lighter every day, right? And days are going to be about to become longer. but you're right there at the darkest moment. Well, of course, that's where you're going to put it. So I'm pretty convinced by Forbes' idea that that's where you would put these things. And there's a contentious sort of debate about Christmas. Then how the Christian Christmas fits into that. So one side would say the Christians put this Christmas celebration right there as a way to provide an alternative, or maybe even a contender to these pagan celebrations of midwinter. And the other side would say, no, they put it there because they really believe that's when Jesus was born. And so that's where they put it, because that's where when they thought Jesus was born. And so, it's a debate, and who knows for sure. Christianity is developing in the 300s and 400s and 500s. It's developing regionally, and so you've got just a lot of regional expressions of these celebrations. And in fact, the Council of Nicaea, just to kind of circle back to that, we think of the Council of Nicaea as mainly focused on the identity of Jesus, who is Jesus Christ in the Christian tradition. But if we were there, the main thing that they were debating and resolving was the date of Easter. When should we celebrate Easter? And the point is that there were a lot of regional varieties about when to date Easter, when to celebrate Easter. And so these things were not entirely figured out. And in fact, maybe just to really wrap it back around, the date of Easter, trying to find the date of Easter, was a major reason that scholars in that era began to think about the dating of other things. And so they needed some way of clocking years and identifying, okay, well, when was Jesus born? That might lead us to when he was crucified and resurrected and all of that. And so like the date of Jesus' birth is very much part of the story of the dating of Easter. All that's to say that there were these regional variations. Some Christians were celebrating the birth of Christ at Epiphany, in January. Some were celebrating it in March. Some were celebrating it in early fall. And then there was a tradition that was celebrating it around December 25th. And so, and then as you mentioned, Nicholas gets tied into all this because his death date, which is the kind of his feast day, was December 6th. And so it's already there in the season, and there's gift giving associated with Nicholas. And then there's also some gift giving and partying associated with Christmas, and eventually those things are going to merge together, at least in the American context. And again, if we were in other parts of the world, especially Europe, they do keep those separate. Nicholas Day is more for gift giving, and then Christmas is more for family celebrations and worship service and things like that.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, like is Christmas being codified around December 25th a byproduct of just Saint Nick's mark in history, or was this like a discussion that was occurring before Saint Nick kind of rose to prominence?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Nicholas does not really get associated tightly with Christmas until, the 1800s, and in the American context, to be sure. Christmas was being celebrated already, but, for the most of Christian history, Christmas, was kind of I don't want to say somber, but a very staid, simple sort of celebration. Not the big blowouts, obviously, that you see now. You think about the Advent season, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, traditionally are similar to the season of Lent leading up to Easter, a time of fasting and prayer and kind of solemn preparation. And so the birth of Christ would have been seen more like, I don't know if your church follows the Christian calendar, or just any other date in the Christian calendar, not some major cultural celebration. And then, of course, as you know, the Puritans didn't even want to celebrate Christmas at all. We've got pretty good evidence that, it's not really, a major marker. I mean, the Congress is meeting on December 25th, and through the 1800s. So it's just not something that people recognize anymore, that they might, set aside a day for, like, I don't know, Trinity Sunday or All Saints Day or Epiphany or whatever, some of these other major holidays in the Christian church. It was just seen as another one of those, and not really all that, certainly without the cultural significance that it has come to have.
This is like a mind-blowing conversation. I love it. We may look like calm, but I guarantee you both of us were just like, what? This is crazy.
I'm assuming you probably get this a lot, right, Adam?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
It definitely reorients us. And, we think about Christmas as a cultural invention, really taking shape in the 1800s and 1900s. So there's this idea that what we're trying to do is when you think about Christmas in the American context, a lot of times, I'm sure even at your church, we talk about, putting Christ back in Christmas and recovering the Christian Christmas and this sort of thing. And that's always been a little bit of a myth. Judith Flanders is a scholar of the kind of Victorian era, and done a great book where she has reviewed. So in the 1800s, your Christmas cards started to become a thing. And so she's reviewed all these Christmas cards that are out there and historically. And, what she's able to show is it's not the case that Christmas started as a, this kind of this Christian tradition of whatever. It's more that it began as a domestic and family and even commercial cultural event. And then through the Christmas card industry and other things, they started to try to add in the Christian, birth of Christ back into it. But only after this thing had become a cultural phenomenon. It really wasn't the case that it was this massive, what I'm trying to say is it wasn't the case there was this massive Christian celebration that got taken over by commerce and secularism or whatever. Rather, it was the case that secularism, and commerce and all this thing created this massive cultural phenomenon. And then the Christians came back and was like, hey, wait a minute, we want to be part of this as well. And so,
that is so funny.
Exactly. So it kind of like messes with your mind a little bit.
It does. And so, okay, I want to get into more depth on how we got to today, because I think this is great. But I'd love, kind of help me understand, like, so when we're thinking about the Santa Claus we see today, he has flying reindeer. He has this sleigh, the reindeer and sleigh, number one, right? And if you remember right, in wasn't the Chronicles of Narnia that he shows up as Saint Nicholas with his sleigh and all that. So you have this, you have elves, you have a toy shop, right? You have the North Pole, right? I guess like him going down chimneys. Where did these things come from? And you can hit any of them or whatever. Yeah. Just kind of get in the general sense. Why do we have this picture of Santa Claus living on a North Pole? All these elves, the thing you see in the Christmas movies, and in what is it? The train movie. Why am I forgetting it?
Polar Express.
Polar Express. Basically, where did Polar Express come from?
Yeah, that's great. Just as a side note, C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, talks about Christmas, has Father Christmas there. And that was one thing that Tolkien did not like about C.S. Lewis's work. He thought that those worlds should be pure and should be separate, and that he was sort of frustrated that Lewis, mixed in Christmas references into this Narnian world that should be pure. Anyways, you're right. The basis of the gift giving and the chimney and that sort of thing comes from a story that we have from very early on about Nicholas, and it's that story of the three dowries. That Nicholas, as a young man, he's not even a bishop yet. He's still, a young man. He hears about a family in town who has lost everything, and the father has become so desperate that he is, anticipating needing to sell his daughters off. What some kind of slavery, servitude, maybe prostitution. It's not totally clear. Nicholas decides to intervene, but he wants to do so anonymously. He doesn't want to be singled out for any act of generosity or praised or whatever. And so in the middle of the night, he drops some bags of gold. He's recently received an inheritance from his deceased parents, and he decides to spend it this way by delivering those bags of gold. And so as that story gets retold kind of through the years, you have additions to it where Nicholas shows up and the windows are locked. And so he has to drop the bag of gold down through the chimney. And, the girls have their stockings up to dry there by the fireplace. And, a bag of gold drops into a stocking there by the fireplace. And so those are kind of later, elaborations of the story. But as I mentioned to you, it's really in the early 1800s that you have all these other accoutrements and developments that start to happen. You've got Germans in Pennsylvania who are celebrating St. Nicholas giving. You've got other Catholics in the lower countries who are celebrating St. Nicholas. But then in New York, you've got John Pintard and Washington Irving, who are some major movers and shakers. And they're trying to create some kind of customs and traditions that are American, right? They've got this, the early 1800s, we're trying to not only reclaim some heritage, European heritage, but also, create some really American type traditions. So, thinking about like celebrating the birthday of George Washington and celebrating the 4th of July and all those kinds of things. And so they start a historical society for St. Nicholas, and begin introducing the idea of Washington Irving in his Knickerbocker history, introduces the idea of Nicholas as this kind of comical character who flies around in a sleigh and is a little bit elf-like and delivering presents in the middle of the night. And then you've got The Night Before Christmas, the famous poem that comes out in 1822 and begins to circulate. And of course, in that poem, you've got reindeer who are named and identified, and you've got the full description of St. Nicholas with the beard and the pipe and the fur coat and all of this, and he's giving gifts in a really domestic kind of way. But there's another really famous children's book called The Christmas Friend, or The Child's Friend, I think is the name of it. And it depicts like this artist just kind of out of nowhere, right? Is depicting St. Nicholas in a sleigh on top of roofs with reindeer. As this story continues to sort of snowball, various department stores begin to pick up on St. Nicholas as a gift giver. And it's a great commercial move because, think about it, at the holiday season, you're wanting people to come in and buy. But if you could wrap it in the cloak of, well, this is not just, I didn't just spend money on you. This is a gift from St. Nicholas. And, it just makes it more attractive, right? And so you start to have window displays with St. Nicholas, and you start to have kind of department store Santas. So you can come in, kids can come in and share their wish list with Santa Claus. And it's not that, it's not this grubby, greedy, just commercial transaction. We're just buying stuff off of shelves. It's being mediated through kind of the innocent and loving hands of St. Nicholas. And it kind of makes it, more magical and pure in all of this. And so you've got the depictions of Nicholas. Thomas Nast is a famous political cartoonist in the 1800s. 1865, he draws Nicholas, and he's got him in like some kind of Arctic location. but he's got the red coat and the white fur trim, and he's hanging out kind of with the Eskimos or whatever. But it just starts to snowball, right? So you just start getting these images of Nicholas, and in some ways, I go, why did he get the red coat and all this? Well, these are adaptations from his look as a bishop. So you think about a traditional European bishop, or maybe even you've seen some traditional European Santas. They're wearing ecclesiastical robes, maybe a red robe with probably some kind of red mitre hat, and a white stole, and maybe a belt and all this kind of stuff. So as you begin to soften these things out, maybe you would keep the color red and the coat and that sort of thing, and that's some kind of red hat, but you'd soften it out and make it more fantastical and magical, and go that way. And to your question of why the North Pole, Thomas Nastor, because he's wearing this heavy red coat, so he's got to come from somewhere cold. And then also in the late 1800s, explorers are beginning to explore the North Pole and the South Pole. So it's just kind of in the air. People are fascinated by the North Pole and the South Pole. There's these famous expeditions that are happening at the turn of the 20th century. And, these are magical places, right? I mean, you've got the Northern Lights, you've got polar bears, penguins, you got all kinds of just crazy stuff. Why wouldn't Santa Claus come from someplace like that? It definitely makes more sense than coming from, the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, right? So you kind of add all that together, and it's a big snowball sort of effect, right? There's not one single. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, the modern Santa Claus came from the Coca-Cola ads. And you'll hear that sometimes, but it's like, well, that's way too simplistic, right? This did not just come out of nowhere. It's got a lot of people. It's a very grassroots effort. And that's what's great about it too, right? These are grassroots efforts. These are people in local situations doing something. They're not being told what to do. They're just making this stuff up. And it's great.
That is a lot. And I want to see if I can trace kind of the thread of thought that you've led us on so far. So Saint Nick, real person, bones spread all over the place, because he was the saint of merchants, ships, navies. Stories about him kind of traveled all over the globe, and obviously I'm oversimplifying. And when the stories come to America, capitalism sort of helped create like a more like distinct image of who he is. That's sort of fueled by, personal stories, what's happening at the time, and so on. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right on target there. It's a very American story. I don't know how else to say it, right? The America, especially in the 1800s, really sees itself as a melting pot. And, I think there's a lot of this problematic with that idea of, especially today, right? In 2024, we'd want to avoid, thinking of culture, advocating for some kind of melting pot culture. But in the 1800s, they like that image of a melting pot that you're bringing together various traditions and cultures, and you're making something new. And it's part of the American project is to make it commercial, make it pop, make it fun, and make it accessible to everybody, whether you're religious or not, whether you're of German or Italian descent or whatever. We're going to try to make this kind of as domesticated as possible, and maybe at its best and worst, right? That's America at its best and worst. So I definitely think, obviously, there's a lot of great criticism of Santa Claus and Santa Claus tradition, to be sure. But again, that's America at its best and at its worst at the same time.
Yeah, I'm curious if maybe you can go into a little bit more detail about how, because you touched on it earlier, but I really want to hear more about how, Protestants or evangelicals try to interject themselves into the Santa story or the Christmas story.
Yeah, it's a very contentious history, of course, especially in evangelical circles. There's the battle for Christmas. I mean, there's a number of books that and research really show that, well, really from the beginning, Christmas has always been a contested holiday in the Christian tradition. So it's not, I don't want to say it's just the evangelicals or just the Puritans or whatever that have thought Christmas is problematic, but kind of from and that goes back to that discussion we said about, the origins of Christmas. Is Christmas an alternative, just a kind of an alternative to these, pagan wintertime festivals? Or are we trying to actually, provide a contending alternative that's challenging those pagan alternatives? Well, you can think about maybe at your own church, do we do Halloween? Well, maybe what if we did a trunk or treat? And then we have to think, well, is the trunk or treat celebration in the church parking lot, we're going to give out candy, we're going to have people dress up. Are we doing this just as a fun kind of add-on to Halloween, and we're basically celebrating Halloween in our own way? Or are we saying, no, we're doing this because we don't believe in Halloween and we're rejecting Halloween as satanic, so we're going to get together, all dress up, give out candy in the church parking lot? You know what I mean? So it's the same kind of deal, right? Why are we doing Christmas? Is it as an alternative, like a Christian alternative? It's like, no, we don't celebrate that pagan stuff. All we do is get together and eat a lot and, give out presents and, all that kind of stuff. But no, it's not the pagan Christmas. Or are we just saying, no, we're absolutely, I'm going to put my nativity scene out front, but I'm also going to put my big old polar bear right next to it, inflatables, and it's just going to be all one big mess.
Yeah. And this conversation is so good. And I have so many questions and thoughts. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what can I ask with, the 14 minutes, 15 minutes we have left? Because it's there's so much I want to ask. But I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is, what lessons do you feel like in our modern society, what can we draw between St. Nicholas and the legacy of St. Nicholas and addressing contemporary issues in our faith, things like generosity, things like community? And maybe a better way to put it is, what would you want, as someone who studied this, what would you love to see reemerge in the image of Santa Claus and Saint Nick, that would be remembered and reemerged and brought back to the fore in our Christmas celebrations?
Yeah, that's great. I want to be careful because Christmas celebrations are, for a lot of families, they're traditional, they're nostalgic, they're communal, like you say. I don't want to necessarily take away Santa Claus, or tell Christians and just people in general, oh, you shouldn't do that because it's just an invention and it's whatever. That's how traditions live and grow and continue. We make stuff up, and if it works, then we keep doing it. So people have a tradition of watching National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Well, what did they do before that movie was released? Everything so we add these traditions, and then we drop some, and then we do others. So that's okay. I think what I would love to see in churches and in Christian communities is a recovery, in addition to those things, of St. Nicholas. And I've known there are a lot of guys who portray Santa Claus, but also have the costuming and the stories for St. Nicholas. And so maybe instead of inviting, Santa Claus to come visit the children at church, why not have St. Nicholas, find somebody that can do St. Nicholas and show up and tell some of those stories to add to that tradition. So now it becomes a tradition of every year we get a visit from St. Nicholas, and he tells us, kooky old stories from his life, instead of just, reindeer and the North Pole kind of stories. And there are a lot of stories from St. Nicholas that I think could really be recovered and be important to us. Yes, he was a gift giver. That's definitely part of his legacy. That's definitely part of his story. He's generous, to be sure. But, as I mentioned, just in brief passing, he also was kind of a patron of his city. He was advocating for justice. I mentioned the story of him intervening just to stop the beheading of 3 innocent individuals. So here's somebody who was in the common square, in the public square, working for justice, working for the benefit of his community. And there's a really, speaking kind of politics kind of stuff, there's another famous story where and this probably is legendary, I don't know, but there's a story of him traveling to Constantinople to petition to Constantine for lower taxes for his area, for his region, the Myra region. And so, here's somebody that is, very much involved in civic life.
I'm down with that.
Yeah, right. So the funny part of that story is he's able to convince Constantine to dramatically reduce the tax requirement for his region. And so he gets it in writing, and Nicholas quickly rolls up this scroll, ties it off and throws it into the water. Well, the next morning before Nicholas leaves town to kind of return to Myra, the emperor, Constantine changes his mind. Oh my God, what did I do? That was insane. I should not have reduced taxes so much. So he recalls Nicholas back to the court and says, hey, I'm going to need that scroll back. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm not going to do that. And of course, Nicholas can only say, I don't have the scroll anymore. I threw it in the water. So sorry. And then, of course, when he travels back to Myra, lo and behold, the scroll has washed up to shore. And of course, it's got the emperor's signature on it, his seal and all that. So it's valid. And what can you do? So it's a great story, right, of his kind of political maneuverings. And I don't know what we want to do with that politically, but it's a fun story.
So you Saint Nick better than anybody. So I have 2 questions. One kind of just a quick one because I don't think that we touched on it, and then sort of a more philosophical type question. So my first question is, how did we get Santa from Saint Nick? Is that just a language thing?
Oh yeah, it absolutely is just a kind of a corrupting of the language. So the Dutch Sinterklaas is just Saint Nicholas in Dutch is Sinterklaas. And so if you just kind of keep sort of massaging that in your brain, Sinterklaas, you would come up with Santa Claus. And there are a lot of variations, again, in Germanic and again, these Dutch and French variations that just sort of morph into from Nicholas into Claus and, Saint into Santa, of course, in Spanish, Santa, Saint. So it just is just a corruption of that name. And there are a lot of names that, are taken from Nicholas today. So the name Colin, for example, the British name Colin is a corruption of Nicholas, or Colette, the French girl's name Colette is a version of Nicholas. There's a lot of those.
Yes. And my last question is, if Saint Nick were alive today, and we were fortunate enough to have him on the podcast after he's had a chance to, walk around the malls and hear the Goodwill people ring their bells and stuff. What do you think his commentary would be about the time?
I love that question, but I don't know that we can answer it, right? I really hesitate to, I guess, project, I don't know, my own analysis into the mind of Nicholas. This is a man of his time, of the early 4th century. And so, what would he say about, the world today, the church today, politics today, society? Who knows? It probably, my guess is always on these kind of things, he probably wouldn't be what you would want him to say, right? There's this great quote And I think it was Niebuhr maybe that talks about, a lot of times when we do scholarship on Jesus, it's like looking down a deep well, and at the bottom of the well, you see a reflection of yourself, and a lot of times that happens right when we want Jesus, of course, to be on our side and to take up our causes and have our views on society and politics and family and all that kind of stuff. I mean, who knows, right? Probably it's just wishful thinking. And I guess so. I don't know. I know it's not the answer you wanted, but I'd be really hesitant to guess what Nicholas would do in 2024.
And this is kind of my last big one, and then just some practical ones to follow before we close. What's the most important lesson do you feel like we should learn from this transformation of Santa Claus? I'm sure there's a bunch of lessons. It's okay. It doesn't have to be, it's right off the top of your head. So whatever comes to mind. But what do you think is the most important forgotten lesson that we can learn from this transformation and how we ought to look at these traditions that we're surrounded with, and these cultural phenomenon of these holidays that are so huge in our culture? Yeah.
No one owns Christmas. No one gets the right to say, here's how you ought to do it, and here's the only way. I think that's, to me, a main lesson of this is, like I say, it's grassroots. It's always morphing, and that's what keeps it alive, really. If you don't have people that are telling new stories and creating new traditions, then the thing dies. And so I would say, some people would say, well, we need to get rid of all of this and, get back to whatever the tradition, whatever they're in their mind, the nostalgic, traditional, real thing is. Well, that's a good way to kill everything. But it's not really, we're always inventing these things, and it's okay just to go ahead and embrace that. And so again, if your family says, you know what, I'm not comfortable, like Will was saying, hey, like this Santa guy is like way too white. We want to do our own thing. That's great. Do it. Nobody, it's the Wild West. It should be. And that's what keeps it interesting and alive. So do what your family is comfortable with, and what you feel like is, and don't be afraid of creating new traditions. Right. So, I love the idea of saying, hey, maybe we've really focused on our own selves a lot at Christmas. Maybe a new family tradition is that as our kids get older, we're going to go and serve somewhere on Christmas morning, or at least on December the 6th, St. Nicholas Day. We're going to, volunteer somewhere. We're going to collect toys for a toy drive or something like that. And suddenly you find something that is deeply meaningful that you didn't even know you needed. And it was there all along.
I love that. What a great answer. Thank you. I would love for you to just give us, what are some resources? Again, I know you've written some books. I'd love for you to talk, just kind of let those know what publications you've come out about this subject, and what are resources that you recommend for people that they've listened to this and they want to kind of do their own reading and study into it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, I've written The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus, and a little book on Christmas. But William Bennett wrote another great little introduction. I think it's called I'm looking over my shoulder there. The Real Nicholas. He was the guy that did the Book of Virtues. But he wrote a great little book on St. Nicholas that's rich, it's historical, and it goes from the historical person all the way up to the current, practices and ideas and traditions. That's a great little book. As I mentioned, I'll just pull it out here. I mentioned Bruce Forbes, and this is his book, Christmas, A Candid History. Again, as you can tell, it's super thin, very readable in a holiday season. That might be another one I would really recommend as well.
That's great. So what work do you have coming up? What are you working on right now? And how can people get a hold of you or follow you in your work and what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much. Currently, I teach undergraduates, so my current work is doing just that. I'm really interested in the way that these traditions evolve. It's kind of what we've been talking about, and trying to not only trace the evolution, of course, but seeing how it is that some elements seem to survive the culling, and then some elements fall away, and really try to trace some of that out. So that's maybe the next thing I'm working on with St. Nicholas and Santa Claus.
It's awesome. How can people get a hold of you or follow you if they can?
I'm really terrible about the social media thing. I've got an email address, but I am on Instagram and Facebook. But I'm pretty terrible about posting there. I'm so sorry to say. You're doing the right thing, Josh. Trying to sell me, trying to give me an opportunity to put it out there.
Hey, it's all good.
It's terrible. Yeah, no, just watch your podcast, right? And
exactly.
Just get the information from you guys. That's what I recommend.
That's great. Well, this has been thank you for coming on the program with us today, Adam. It's been such a great conversation. I have so many more questions. Maybe we can do another one next year, talk about Santa again, or some of the other thoughts you've had, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Yes, absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Dr. Adam English. Again, pick up his book, The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus. And we just appreciate everything you guys are doing. And we hope you have a great holiday season. And whatever you're celebrating this holiday season, we pray and that it's good for you and you have a great time with family. We really appreciate your support. Love you guys a ton. And that's it for this show today. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless, guys. Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.